Okay. Hello, and warm welcome to LSEE and to our event on the archives of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. This event is hosted by LSEE Research on Southeast Europe. I'm Denisa Kostovićeva, an associate professor in global politics based at European Institute here at the LSEE. And I'm a principal investigator of a project funded by the European Research Council that looks at transitional justice and peace building. Tonight's event is focused on the archives of the ICTY, and it engages with two related or interrelated developments, recent developments in transitional justice. For those who are non-experts, when we talk about transitional justice, we talk about policies and approaches taken by states and societies in dealing with the legacy of war crimes and gross human rights violations. So I think two events that, the two developments with which this event sort of engages with are the fact that we're looking at sort of a renewed interest in the archives of human rights prosecutions. Tonight we're examining the archives of the ICTY, and we know that ICTY, the Yugoslavia Tribunal, along with the Rwanda Tribunal, were ad hoc courts, and they were harbingers of a sort of a novel approach to the legacy of mass atrocity, and led to the permanent way sort of that we have in the institutionalization of the International Criminal Court. In other words, the institution that is set up there without the limit of time, unlike these two tribunals that we know were specifically focused on Yugoslavia and Rwanda separately, that basically exemplifies the normalization of the norm of impunity. So what's interesting about the ICTY, we've debated endlessly the impact of this court while the proceedings were taking place. But this event speaks to relatively, I would say, sort of novel realization that this court continues to influence politics and policies in the region, as well as has broader impacts in terms of how we are learning how the law functions in these cases, even after its end. And sort of the archives are the crucial sort of source or fountain of that new knowledge and sort of understanding of influence of the court after it has finished its work. And the second sort of related development has to do with what we call a digital turn in transitional justice. And I think digitization of records of human rights prosecutions has radically transformed possibilities for our in-depth engagement with multiple aspects of trial proceedings, including the establishment of the forensic truth about a conflict in question. And I think we could also argue that the access to this information has in itself democratized learning and about the operation of the international criminal justice. Now, this kind of is happening alongside another parallel development, and that is the development in computing power and application of methods that are appropriate for the analysis of these vast amounts of data and textual data. So now we have new tools, in addition to accessibility to the data, that can allow us to gain new insights into the various aspects of trial proceedings with various angles, whether you want to look at witnesses or perpetrators, etc. So all these enhance the value of the archives and basically point to multiple ways that this institution continue to matter beyond their end. So this is kind of where sort of we come to this panel and to sort of the topical nature of the discussion tonight with the panel of top experts in the field who will engage with this question of archives and what the archives can do. As I said, beyond sort of when the work of a tribunal is over. So I'm delighted to welcome Ivor Vukušić. Ivor is assistant professor in international history at Utrecht University and visiting research fellow at the Department of War Studies, King's College London. She's a historian and a genocide scholar, and her work is on irregular armed groups, genocide, mass violence, and transitional justice, especially criminal accountability. Before coming to The Hague in 2009, she spent 3 years in Sarajevo, where she worked as a researcher and analyst at the Special Department for War Crimes at the Office of the Prosecutor. Eva has recently published her first book, Serbian Paramilitarism, The Breakup of Yugoslavia, State Connections and Patterns of Violence, with Routledge. And Eva is also one of the 3 editors of the new CEU press series, Perpetrators of Organized Violence, Eastern and Central and Southeastern Europe. Next to me is Jasna Dragović-Soso. Jasna is professor of international politics and history at Goldsmiths University of London. She's also a visiting professor here at LSEE. Professor Dragović-Soso has published numerous scholarly articles and book chapters on intellectuals and dissent, nationalism, state dissolution and international intervention, and on the processes of memory construction and transitional justice in the post-Yugoslav region. She has also provided expertise on the post-Yugoslav region to various non-academic stakeholders, including the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and International Commission on the Balkans. And in the middle, Ivor Sokolić. Dr. Ivor Sokolić is a lecturer in politics and international relations at the University of Hertfordshire and also visiting fellow at the European Institute at the London School here at LSEE. He was also involved as a postdoctoral researcher with the ERC project that I just mentioned. And also Ivor is the author of a book titled International Courts and Mass Atrocity Narratives of War and Justice in Croatia. Ivor as well is widely published on issues of transitional justice and identity in leading scholarly papers. So let us give our warm LSE welcome to our speakers. So we'll proceed with short contributions by our panelists, and then we'll open it up for questions, and we hope to have kind of a general discussion. For those of you who are tweeting, we have a hashtag for today's event, which is hashtag LSEE ICTY. Also, please note that we are recording this event, and if you don't have any technical glitches, we'll make this recording publicly available. So we'll proceed with first starting with, I'll hand over to Eva.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the kind introduction, and I'm very happy to be here, and it's really nice to see you and to be able to participate again in in-person events after what feels like a century. So I'm very happy to be here. So as Denisa was just saying, we'll just kick off with some introductory comments and then hopefully have a discussion based on what generates most interest, I suppose, between us, but also obviously with the audience. So in the next 15 minutes, I'll make pretty much 3 points. One will have to do with the content of the archives in The Hague, so at the ICTY, what's in them and how they came to be, so to say. The other is going to be about the challenges and opportunities of working with this material as I experienced it. And the third point is going to be about how I use this material in my work. As Denisa was saying, I'm a historian and a genocide scholar, so I completely realize and acknowledge that I come to this material from a certain perspective, with certain questions and conventions and practices, and other people from other disciplines are going to approach this material differently. So just to say a couple of words to kick us off about the ICTY itself. So it was established, for those of you that might don't know or have forgotten, it was established in 1993 by the UN Security Council as the first ad hoc tribunal. And it dealt with the former Yugoslavia, and it was open for about 25 years, generating an enormous material. When it first started, the ICTY was the first such court. And in many ways, it was learning by doing. And for our story, this is not irrelevant, because the archives were then as well created kind of on the go. And having been in The Hague since 2009, it was really interesting to observe the move and kind of the changes that brought the archives, and sort of they themselves became a central point of discussion. While earlier on no one cared, no one asked about it, it was really not a thing. And we can talk about later, maybe if you're interested, why I think that is, why I think that the archives themselves became an increasingly important topic in The Hague. So it was established in 1993. Right now, the ICTY has been closed since 2017. Now the institution that deals with the management of the work that still remains is the Residual Mechanism. So we're going to be using the two, but when we say ICTY archives, these are the archives managed by the mechanism. It's just an easier acronym to use than the mechanisms were. So it's really the only international tribunal that allows such wide access to its material. For example, I live and work in The Hague, so the International Criminal Court doesn't have the same practices. And generally speaking, this kind of material is not as accessible elsewhere as it is at the Yugoslavia Tribunal and its sister court, the Rwanda Tribunal as well. So the only trial that is left that the residual mechanism is dealing with, so the residual mechanisms part that deals with the former Yugoslavia is Stanisic and Simatovic, for those of you in the room that know. These are two officials from the State Security Service of Serbia, and they have been in various shapes in legal proceedings for almost 2 decades. This trial is, the retrial I should say, should end in 2023 after 20 years, which is maybe a topic in itself. So in some ways this discussion is also really topical, because from next year onwards the tribunal, the only thing that it's going to be doing really is like a repository of this material. So all the other work, so to say, has been completed. There are some outstanding contempt issues, but for our purposes here, we can say that it's pretty much done. So this material is there, and I think we should take advantage of it. And for that, I think it's also good that we gathered here to talk about how to do it. So point 1, about the contents of the archives. So the archives are clearly a reflection of the legal process. So they are not something that kind of falls from the sky. They were shaped by investigations and trials. They were shaped by what the prosecution decided to charge, how the defense decided to argue their case. So this is something that really needs to be kind of known to all. They were created through this legal process. And the driving force procedurally in this case is the prosecution. I don't have time to go into the details here, but maybe some of this issue is going to be picked up also in the Q&A, because then prosecutorial choices about which crimes to pursue and which crimes not to pursue is reflected in what the archives contain. So if the prosecution investigates something and decides, you know what, we're not going to charge a murder in village X because we have 12 similar murders already in this indictment, then village X is going to be minor, if not completely absent from the story. Let me just read a couple of things that relate to the size of the archives. So in one word, they're really colossal. And we are talking about 2,400 linear meters of physical and 1.5 petabytes of digital records. I don't know precisely how much that is, but it sounds really, like when you try to imagine 2.4 1,000 meters or 310,000 judicial records are available through the public database. Out of those, 100,000 are in BCS. So BCS is the acronym for Bosnian, Croatian, Serbian, which is the name that the ICTY uses for what used to be known as Serbo-Croatian, so the language that we speak when we speak to one another. There are 194,000 public exhibits, so pieces of evidence, and 83,000 are in BCS. Much of this material is in both BCS and English, and all of these items, these documents, some run into hundreds of pages themselves. So one individual document can be 1 page, but it can also be 1,000 pages, depends on what it is. So no one person can ever have a complete idea of what's in there. It's just not possible for any individual. So collectively, we can mine it and work on it, but no one person can ever have a full idea of what's going on in those pages. There's also 24,500 public transcripts and tens of thousands of hours of courtroom session recordings. 70% of all of that is publicly available. 5,000 witnesses almost testified in the 25-year history of the ICTY, some of them numerous times. For example, survivors from Srebrenica, the few that survived, testified in numerous cases. So, for example, the recently completed cases of Radovan Karadžić or Ratko Mladić, almost 600 witnesses appeared in each of those cases, and about 10,000 or 12,000 individual exhibits in each of those cases. So it's really a mammoth kind of collection. And I watched a lot of this play out in real time because I live in The Hague and I used to work in the building as well. So it's really massive. So whoever goes about, and decides to use this material, you need to be very strategic about what you're actually going to be doing. So maybe we can get into some of these practicalities in a moment. Point 2. Challenges and opportunities. 2 points that I would make here is in terms of opportunity, it's volume. So in some senses, it's an opportunity, but it's a challenge. But the fact that this material exists and the fact that it's available is incredibly valuable to me as a researcher, but also as a former Yugoslav, because I lived through this war, and for me as a citizen, it's important to have this material where we can find at least some answers as to what happened to all of us. A challenge is definitely confidentiality, and some cases are more difficult than others. For example, Stanišić and Simatović that I was mentioning recently, so the State Security Service, 2 officials that were charged, among other things, with establishing, running, and operating, paying, and directing various kinds of paramilitary forces in Croatia and Bosnia. That trial is particularly confidential. And let me give you a tiny gem from my book. The final defense brief. So this is basically the document that comes at the end of the trial. It's written by the defense team where, of course, the defense puts together their evidence and their legal arguments to make their best case for the judges. So this is a document that is, in the first trial, 308 pages long, but has the word redacted in place of text, what I would say an astonishing 2,788 times. So a bunch of footnotes are blacked out, a bunch of text is blacked out. So I find that frustrating, but also in some ways like amusing that that's possible to have that much stuff blacked out. Whatever concerns kind of state connections is often the material that's going to be redacted. And states often make arguments about, state security and things like that. And of course, in itself, that's also possible in domestic trials, and it's not in itself, controversial, but just to warn you that certain things are very difficult to do research on because of this confidentiality issues. Importantly also, and procedurally, at this moment, there is no process by which this material can be declassified. So there's no Freedom of Information Act. There's no way for me to write to the mechanism to say, hello, I'm a historian, can you please tell me why this is classified? When is it going to be not classified? So that's a real problem. Because in other archives within 30 years, you could make a case, that these are open and this is state practice often. So here we don't have such a process, and we can get into why that is a little bit later. But I think it's really important because theoretically a bunch of these things can remain closed and inaccessible for ever. So I think that's quite frustrating. And point 3, how do I use my archive? So I just published the book, which the host very kindly put up on the screen. I'm not going to talk about the book very much, but I want to talk about a little bit how I use this material. And I want to say that I don't base it on judgments. So if you read my book, I don't say anyone is guilty or is not guilty. I don't say anything about legal findings, and I don't make claims about things being or not being genocide, or things like that. It's not my job. I'm a historian, so that's not how I perceive my task. So how I wrote this book and how I used this material was to tell a story, who these people were and what were they up to and why. That was my sort of driving force when I was writing this book. So we can again get into discussions about why this is the case, because other researchers approach it differently. And to some extent it might be a personal preference, might be a disciplinary preference, but that is how I did it. So outcomes of trials are of no consequence to me, in the sense that in 2023, if the judges come out and say this and this about Stanisic and Simatovic, nothing in my book will change. I'm not going to be, I'm of course curious about what's going to happen, but it's not going to be affecting my work in any way. Because I work with primary sources. So I take things that the prosecution presents, things that the defense presents, and then I read the original arguments, the original documents. Importantly, crucially even, the materials that I use are not, quote unquote, enemy documents. These are not documents that the Croatian intelligence service or the Bosnian intelligence service wrote about these paramilitaries. This is about what the people on the same side wrote about them. This is about what their own members said about it. This is about sort of people on the same side. The Yugoslav army, the Bosnian Serb army, the Bosnian Serb police, various journalists, people in the kind of the civil authorities, on the same side. And I think that's really, really important for the validity of my findings. So these are not quote unquote enemy documents. So when I say something about Tigers or Red Berets or something, I'm using documents and statements from the Yugoslav officers, for example, in the field that observed them. Just to kind of to slowly draw towards my conclusion, navigating this database and conducting successful searches is an art form. And requires a lot of practice. This database was not designed for popular use. This was an internal database that they just decided to open up to the world. So it does not lend itself to casual browsing. You cannot go in there and be like, da, 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 da. It just doesn't work. You have to know a lot before you even start navigating it. Because it's clunky, it's enormous, and some of it kind of hangs on detail. For example, are you searching for document P1234 or P01234 or P001234? It might have significant consequences as to what pops up. So this is, I think, something that everyone who does this work will or has encountered before. But having spent 20 years looking at these trials and working in different shapes and forms with this material, I've kind of learned some of these tricks. But the main thing is that the trial is the organizing principle of the archive. So before you would ever go into doing any kind of research, your first thing to read is the indictment. The indictment is going to tell you what this trial is about. And based on that, you could look at opening briefs, also something that the prosecution or the defense, or the final briefs, I think, are the best, but they're not always available. These are the places where you can look at the narrative of the story. So forget the legal arguments. For me, at least, it doesn't matter what legal arguments they're making, but look at the sources that they're using to advance their story, because basically they're telling a story. This is what we say happened, and the defense or the prosecution, this is what someone else says that happened. So look at the things that they cite and try to then look at what documents are presented with the numbers before or after, but that's maybe a little bit already complicated. But to look at just some of the examples, you can look at the work that Christian Axbo-Nielsen recently published on the Bosnian Serb police, or you can look at the work of Hikmet Karčić, also recently published book, for just some ways in which one can use this archive. I have an article coming out on the archives themselves in the Comparative Southeast European Studies soon that includes quite a lot of these sort of tips and tricks about how the archive was made, what's in it, and how to go about navigating it. So it should be out very soon, so hopefully that's also going to provide some information to younger students who are coming towards this work soon. And so just to close, I am really looking forward to your questions and comments, and maybe we can touch upon some of these things. Again, one thing that I would really like to touch upon is the ethics of doing this kind of research. I didn't have time to go into it right now, but a lot of this archive is about the worst day of someone's life or the last day of someone's life. And I think that should, and it does require a certain sensibility, and I would just like for that to appear in our discussion. I hope I was good on time, and thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Eva, thank you, Denisa. I'm really pleased to be here. And I'm also, I mean, this is a great and important topic, and I'm also really happy to be taking part in what is essentially a kind of book launch of Eva's really good book, which I've had the pleasure to read, and I highly recommend to you if you're interested in the war itself. So I will be focusing on the second part of this question that we're dealing with. I'm not addressing impunity, I'm talking about creating history, which is I think what Eva also focused on, and which I think is important, especially in view of the audience we have here, where there are a lot of young researchers, and I hope some of you will actually be interested enough to pursue this kind of research. Just very briefly, I want to just point out that Eva's book is not a book about the archive. Luckily, she has an article coming out, which I'm looking forward to reading to help me navigate this archive. But it is about Serb paramilitaries. It is a history of the wars of the 1990s and also the period of the immediate aftermath, which is told through an examination of the role played by paramilitaries, Serb paramilitaries more specifically. And she looks at various aspects of the organization, the creation of these paramilitaries, their conduct during the war, their relations with the Milosevic regime, and also their continuing impact in Serbia even after the fall of Milosevic, and notably their implication in the assassination of the reformist Prime Minister Zoran Đinđić in 2003. So it is not just about crimes and genocide, it is really about paramilitaries, and it is a kind of perpetrator history above all. And I mean, obviously I've followed this over the years, I've paid attention to these things, but I mean, Eva's book, I think, is illuminating even for people who have been following over time and who, know a little bit about the region. It is absolutely superb in its depiction of the role that was played by paramilitaries. And as she said herself, she has drawn very heavily on the ICTY archive. She spent 20 years, I think, researching the archive and this topic, which I think really shows when you look at the wealth of material that she engages with and the kinds of documents that she looks at. And I would like to just mention that other than this particular archive, she also uses other sources, and not just trial sources, domestic trials, but particularly, and I think this is the other thing that really needs to be mentioned, investigative journalism from the region, from Serbia itself, and also NGO archives, which is another innovative thing that needs to be highlighted. And I'm speaking here in particular of the Humanitarian Law Center in Belgrade, whose documents you have also used extensively. And as I think she mentioned herself, her book belongs to a new set of histories that have been appearing recently. She has mentioned some of them, which have really use these types of materials that are accessible to researchers and have constructed new histories of the wars of the 90s and sort of related issues and legacies of these wars. So Eva's book is a huge contribution, I think, and is also, I think, a contribution to more broadly to what she calls perpetrator history, which of course is a field that goes back to 1945 and to Nuremberg, really. And so in a way, it kind of compels you to sort of start drawing some little parallels, if you are a historian, and to kind of raise some questions that bring these two tribunals into dialogue. And one of the things that I think stands out immediately is that is the question of the archives. I mean, historians in Germany also very much relied on the Nuremberg archive, and also, it should be said, on the other trials that followed afterwards, also wrote expert reports, which they then used for publications, particularly, for example, the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials of 1963 to 65. And so I think there is some basis here for sort of broadening of the discussion. My sort of initial point about the ICTY archive, and I think Eva's really highlighted that as well in her comments, is the wealth of the material and the value of this resource for researchers. I mean, I think, histories of the war are coming out and are being able to be written largely thanks to the materials that researchers have access to with this archive. And, when you read some of the German historians who talk about Nuremberg, I mean, you will read phrases about how, researchers and historians kind of stand on the shoulders of prosecutors and how important these archives have been for example, Holocaust studies. Although, as I'm sure you all know, Nuremberg was really not that much about the Holocaust when it comes to the legal proceedings. So in a way, this is one of the sort of paradoxes, if you want, about Nuremberg and a misconception about it. But nevertheless, the archive has been hugely important for understanding the Holocaust specifically. This then brings me to a set of questions, and I've kind of tried to group them a bit, although they overlap quite a lot. And one of them Eva has alluded to, and that is what I call the end-user problem. The end-user problem has to do with several things. One is, as Eva mentioned, the sheer volume of the archival material, and the difficulty for a researcher to navigate this material. And I think it comes as perhaps no surprise that these initial histories that Eva has mentioned, and Christian Axbo Nielsen's work, her own work, or the work, for example, of Robert Donia on Karadzic and so on, is written by scholars who have had some formal sort of attachment to the tribunal at one point, expert witnesses or who have worked with the tribunal and who are well versed in the sort of workings of the tribunal and know how to navigate the tribunal archive. And I was not involved at all with the tribunal at any point, and I just made a very basic attempt this afternoon as I was preparing this talk to see if I could, do anything. And I just typed in, Ratko Mladić, there's some sort of parameters which you have to put in, and I just wanted to see if I could access his diaries, the Mladić diaries. And I can tell you, it didn't work at all. You cannot search it with, a keyword. You have to really be able to navigate the system. And this is, I think, as Eva mentioned, the biggest challenge of this archive is you really need to know how to use it. And you can't just go sort of cold turkey and start searching through keywords. And so I suppose my first question is, this problem, this difficulty of navigating the archive itself, how do you think this will impact the writing of history, at least in the short term? And sort of what specialist training do you think the archive really needs to provide in order to enable researchers to be able to access the material? Because this is a major stumbling block, in my view. The second question is a related one. Namely, if we look at Nuremberg and then the subsequent trials that took place in Germany and elsewhere, what is important is that the majority of the German documents that had been captured by the Western Allies were transferred to the West German Bundesarchiv from the late 1950s. And they were there in place and could easily be accessed by German scholars who were, who then used it, and also German prosecutors who then used it to set up future trials. And this, this was really important in paving the way in historiography and also for future trials in Germany, and thus contributed in due course, it has to be said, not immediately, to the process of reckoning with the past in Germany. The situation with the ICTY is, of course, quite different in the sense that, of course, as Denisa has mentioned, the archive is digitized and generally, therefore, more accessible. However, again, as Eva has just mentioned, and as she dwells on in her book, large parts of this archive are redacted. And, the reasons are, for witness protection, or because it's, national security or whatever. But this doesn't change the fact that large sections of this archive are really inaccessible publicly. And of course, on the basis of your own research, my question to you is, what types of information and topics do you think actually remain inaccessible on the wars? And what is the impact of that on history writing? There was one small point that I wanted to raise and I was curious about, which is in your book you cite that about 70% of the archive is now publicly available. And I was just wondering, where did you get that figure from? Because it's such a wealth of material. I don't know who could be calculating this.
The tribunal itself.
Oh, okay.
Right,
Well, I'd be really interested to know, what, and have they looked at what is publicly available and what is not? Because that, I think, is an important question. In this respect, also, I would, there have been debates, and I think you have alluded to it, and this is something else I'd like to ask you is, do you think that it matters where the location of this archive is? There has been a lot of debate around moving the archive to Sarajevo or somewhere else in the region, and there's been quite a bit of controversy about it. Yeah. Do you think this is important? And if you could elaborate on that. And also, related to that, again, dealing with sort of regional histories and regional kind of coming to terms with the past, do you think that the sort of legal side or the legal aspects, and I know you say you don't use the judgments and so on, but that legal aspect of the tribunal, and particularly some of the controversies around that, around some of the indictments and some of the judgments, possibly discourages researchers in the region from actually, wanting to access the archive and using it for their own research. And how do you think such reluctance might be overcome? My final set of questions relates to the broader theme of the relationship between law and historiography and the processes, as I mentioned, of what is called coming to terms with the past. And once again, this is something that was raised by scholars who were writing about the Nuremberg Tribunal and the German case, and it also comes up more generally when looking at the role of tribunals in history writing. And clearly, as you note in the book, and as you just said, the kinds of materials that we will find in a tribunal archive are the result of prosecutorial strategy and case selection. And this relates both to, the kinds of documents we might find and also the witness testimony that we might access in the archive. Again, what does this mean in terms of the kinds of histories that this kind of evidentiary basis tends to produce? And I've already mentioned the importance of the Nuremberg archive for Holocaust studies. However, to illustrate this point perhaps in a very banal way, if I was, let's say, researching the Allied bombings of German cities during the war or the Katyn massacre, for example, I wouldn't go to the Nuremberg archive. And the other point that I think some German historians have mentioned is that There is a tendency in tribunals, for obvious reasons because they are tribunals, to privilege more intentionalist types of explanations that are focused on individuals and their responsibility for the events that unfolded and the crimes that were perpetrated. Again, how does this impact history writing? Now, I know, of course, and I think it's important to mention that the ICTY had a much wider remit than Nuremberg, which was, of course, exclusively focused on German crimes during the war, and that at the ICTY we have a broader selection of crimes from the Yugoslav wars. However, here too, of course, the evidence gathered and the expert testimony that was solicited were greatly determined by prosecutorial strategy and case selection. So, what aspects of the wars, as a historian now, with your historian's hat on, would you say are not covered by the ICT archive? And you know, we can collectively, I think, about what these might be, whether they are, you know, Western involvement in the, you know, Yugoslav wars, for example, or even when you look at paramilitaries because of the nature of the case selection, and this is something you do look at. I mean, for example, if I wanted to research, I don't know, Croat paramilitaries or Bosniak or, I don't know, Albanian or whatever, would I have the same kind of wealth of material that you had when you researched Serb paramilitaries? So, to sum up, and I'm going to finish with this, what are the limitations of an archive that is specifically produced for legal purposes in terms of the type of research that it enables? And at a very general level, what sort of history also can we imagine emerging on the basis of the ICTY archives, and which ones can we imagine not emerging on that same basis? What kinds of histories are the ICTY archives unlikely to promote? Thank you.
Thank you, Jasna. And now our last speaker.
Thank you. And yeah, I mean, I will also speak about the book, because it is a brilliant book, and I really enjoyed reading it, and I think it does make some fascinating contributions. However, I'm going to focus on the first half of those last 4 words, so addressing impunity, a bit more than creating history.
This was not planned.
This was not planned, no. So I think the book shows us a lot about the archives and how it can be used. So actually, in discussing the book, I think we speak a lot about the methodology here. And what I believe we learn from the book is something about the history of the Balkans, something about the theories of how paramilitaries interact with states, and this has a sort of high external validity that we can transport to not only the region today, but also other regions in the world today, for example, Ukraine and Russia. And then it has this methodological implication. So I'll go through those 3. I'll focus a bit more on the methodological at the end. I have far too many questions for Eva, for both of you actually, I believe. So feel free to pick up on any of those. I'll try to keep them to the end, but you'll notice I just keep asking questions. So what the book shows in terms of its sort of historiographical contribution is this sort of state involvement and sort of the formal and informal cooperation between those both inside and outside the state with paramilitaries in the region. There is a bit of a focus on Serbian paramilitaries, but it's not exclusive actually. So I think you do get a bit of an insight into how some of the other states conducted this. And also the book shows this sort of favorable environment of sort of political, social, and economic circumstances that were necessary for paramilitary units to emerge and to thrive as quite dominant actors in the conflict. And this wasn't spontaneous, so the book really makes this clear. This wasn't spontaneous, this was systematic, this was not self-sustained either. So they had institutional support. And these paramilitaries, they served a specific purpose in the conflict. Now, this is shown and recorded in some detail in the archives, and I think Eva sort of teases this out very nicely. Like she said, it's not easy, and in reading the book, you realize how difficult this is. What an expert approach one needs to take, and I think this, you really need to be commended for this, because you can notice how painstaking this process was of showing this. And this was present in the ICTY archives, in some of the ICTY verdicts, in some domestic trials, and I'll move on to why these are a bit harder to access. And you need to really connect the dots between these various sort of repositories. Now, the contribution of the book actually extends beyond just historiography. So there are these sort of present-day implications. So how, for example, the Serbian state acts today, or how the Serbian sort of political infrastructure is set up today. So we actually get a lot of insight into this by looking at how these paramilitaries acted. More broadly, outside of the Balkan context, we also look at how paramilitary actors operate and interact with the states, and what the implications of this are. In the book, there's brief mention of this. Wagner, for example, in Ukraine. Blackwater is mentioned, but numerous other examples globally are mentioned, and this is directly theoretically relevant to them. I think there are three contributions in this theoretical sense. First is that these paramilitary actors, that they persist after the end of a conflict. So they are resilient and adaptable, just the way they were in the Balkans. They abandoned the regime there, and that sort of nurtured them for so many years. But when they saw their opportunity, when it made more sense to abandon it, they abandoned it, and they actually hollowed out the state that they fought for. That's sort of using your words there. So second, the dynamics that are created by these paramilitary ecologies is how they're presented in the book. They persist long after the conflict, and here we can really connect to something that Denisa, for example, wrote about as well, these sort of informal networks of actors that persist after conflict, and they undermine liberal peace building. And there's this notion that a lot of these high-level officials that helped with this got away with it across the region. So it makes any genuine transition actually very hard to achieve, because there are these people there who actually managed to get away with the crimes that continued long after the conflict in some cases. And third is this plausible deniability for how the state operated then, and also how it continues to operate today. So units were established as a solution to a problem that the regime was facing. This need to create plausible deniability while attempting to redraw borders through armed engagement. And this, especially so after, historiographically, after Croatia and Bosnia got their international recognition. Now, this sort of plausible deniability becomes created through manufacturing and sustaining ambiguity about who the units really belong to. So here we see a parallel, for example, again with, for example, Crimea. And it's very difficult to establish criminal accountability because of this, especially for leaders, which has these significant implications that go beyond Syria, Ukraine once again. From the perspective of the state, it makes perfect sense to use these types of actors, especially when they're in the pursuit of territorial or political ambitions that might not be legal. And I mean, very grim, I must say. The writing, there's a brilliant quote in there, which is basically read as, this is how you can do it. This is a valuable lesson, I think I'm quoting here, this is a valuable lesson for other predatory and violent regimes. In other words, this is how you can do it and get away with it, because it still works today. Now, a lot of what we can study here, Eva then says, is quite limited. Archives provide only one part of the story. We need to access more, and a lot remains untold because a lot of these records don't exist in domestic situations. So the archives need to be used in tandem, and this leads me to these sort of methodological implications. One very neat one here is that these archives really show the regional nature of the conflict. So conflict, like many modern conflicts, they're regional in nature. We need to study them beyond borders, and these archives are set up in a way that allows you to do that. It does show us this account of violence that was constructed through the ICTY and through their archives. So Jasna already mentioned that. I'll move on to that as well, because basically there's a lot of writing now. I'm drawing here on Henry Redwood's book about the ICTR archives, of what is this political process involved in the construction of archives, and therefore what is the story that we can tell through it. Verdicts are limited, as you said. Archives are also limited, as Jasna said. So I think we need to think about, and I was going to ask the same question of what account of violence we can construct based on these limitations. However, yeah, Iva's book was not only based on ICTY archives, so we need to work in tandem with other archives. NGOs were mentioned, and I thought this was fascinating. The Humanitarian Law Center in Belgrade was mentioned. Again, I think it's fascinating. We've used it in some of our research as well. NGOs in the region, such as the HLC in Belgrade, Documenta and Zagreb, and many others, have been very successful in their documentation efforts. This is hugely important work, and the scale of the crimes in the region, as happens in many conflicts, it's too big for perhaps any one organization to capture. There is a necessity for NGOs and civil society to help there. Perhaps also it's a less contested space, we could say, because they're collecting documents rather than writing narratives. Now, you can make an argument that that's not the case, but therefore they may have a bit less government opposition in some of their work, because they do face a lot of government opposition. However, and I found this fascinating, you were mentioning the volume of the work, the volume of the archives, almost in a way that it lends legitimacy to the ICTY archives, because they're so huge. And I think in the region now, we also see governments try to replicate this. The case study I would like to bring up that's maybe worth discussing is the Memorial and Documentation Center for the Homeland War in Croatia. This has come up in my own research, but generally, they make a big show of collecting documents. And this seems to lend them legitimacy in the eyes of the public. And this allows them to produce very much one-sided narratives of the conflict, or at least narratives that are heavily laden with a particular view of how the conflict happened. But they're saying they can write it because, look, this is the size of our archive. So how much does volume matter in terms of legitimacy? And interestingly here, when we talk about NGOs, this documentation center is a governmental, non-governmental organization. So it's funded by the government. You can find it in laws, but they present themselves as an NGO, as a direct competitor to some of these civil society group NGOs who are doing the same work. So finally, in terms of questions, I guess 3 broad ones with some sub-questions. Maybe one of those are more appealing. I'm also interested in what will archives look like in future transitional justice processes. So, as we mentioned, this was an ad hoc tribunal. The ICTR was ad hoc. Other tribunals don't do it the same way. Where do we go from here? There's a lot of discussion about domestic war crimes trials as being the future of international criminal law, right? So to have it as a hybrid or domestic trial, how would they construct archives? Will they? If they don't, as a lot of the domestic tribunals currently don't, what are the implications? What do these archives tell us about international efforts at transitional justice? So what does it tell us about the general approach to transitional justice that these international actors took? What is the politics behind constructing the archives? Can they take into account the complexity of conflict? And with the paramilitaries, I think yes, but then also no, because states managed to avoid culpability. So I'm torn here. And then third is, has the ICTY taken a constructive step that future efforts can then take forward? So, okay, the ICTY was learning, like you said, as they were going. Are there lessons here that we can use in the future? How do we build on from this? For paramilitaries, does international criminal law take them into account appropriately or not? So I'll leave it there on some forward focused elements. Thank you very much. And I really, really enjoyed the book, so do go buy.
Thank you very much. So I'm not sure if it's the archives or your book that prompted this set of such rich comments. I was thinking, how would one summarize before handing over to you? I just thought maybe 2 words. One is knowledge. I think that came through all the contributions, right? Using the archives to create new knowledge with a huge kind of a warning tag. Be careful how the knowledge is constructed, right? So this is kind of one big thing. And I think quite unusual in a public event to mention methodology so often. And again, key, right? So what is methodology? Methodology for social scientists is a map, right, that takes us somewhere. And I think it was quite interesting that from all your different perspectives, you reflected on how methodology is important, right? And really, what you find out in the end when you tackle, you know, any kind of data, in this case, this kind of wealth of data provided by the archive, really depends on that little map that you chart in the first instance, obviously starting with your question. So I thought it was quite interesting to hear your questions, but I wouldn't mind collecting questions from the audience, and then we see which ones we address. But I mean, just raising the questions was quite useful to begin to think about things. So please let us know if there is anyone who would like to ask a question. Yeah, and when you do, please introduce yourselves.
Thank you. My name's David Joss, and I come to this from a different perspective. I was a defence counsel at the ICTY, and many years ago I was an undergraduate history student here in King's College, which in some ways helped bring me into this work. So there is.
May I ask which case? I would just be curious.
Yes, I defended Krajnik, and I defended a man called Guerrero in the Popovich case.
I know both.
And I mean, Krajnik's case was about paramilitaries, so I'd probably be interested to read your book. But if I could be excused, I won't be very long. Two or three comments, and then a collective question. The first is redactions in defence briefs. Well, a quick comment about that. I remember at the end of Guerrero's case, we put in an unredacted brief, but a private brief. We were then told by the court to redact it for go public. I don't know whether we ever did that. We thought 300-page brief, we're not being paid for this, why should we redact it? Right. Secondly, I dare say Wayne Jordash, who defended
very well, yeah.
Exactly, I suspect he's just erred on the side of caution, hasn't he?
Right.
Because if you're faced with the prospect of contempt or redaction, you're going to go for redaction. Right. Second, sort of more general and important point, and I dare say you've spoken, Ivor, to lots of lawyers, but telling a story. Yes, my clients were, both of them are dead in fact, were very aware that they were leaving a legacy of history and were keen for their side of history to be left indelibly in the archive of the tribunal. I was not keen on that at all. I'm a traditional English defence lawyer, and all I wanted to do was to say the prosecution hadn't proved its case, and I was not interested in telling a story. Now, unfortunately, most of the defendants there didn't agree with me, but that is something I think worth bearing in mind. Thirdly, the archives, the database. It was a nightmare. At the time. I suspect it's improved a bit, but someone like me with very limited IT skills relied entirely on my legal assistance. They sometimes succeeded, they sometimes didn't. So the story that you just told, the professor just told, was exactly the same problem that we had day in, day out.
It's not only you.
So that hasn't really improved very much at all. But I think my question is this: I'm struck by the fact that all four of you, as you said, Ivor, are BCS speakers. And presumably that's not a coincidence. And perhaps when you tried to put this panel together, you looked for someone who was not a BCS speaker. But I assume, because it reminds me of 40 years ago when I was an undergraduate at this here, that really you needed, in order to do this work, right, to take it further than the undergraduate level, you needed to be able to understand the language in order to do the research. And so perhaps I'm wrong, but presumably that's a very real issue. Because yes, these documents have been translated, but to get the proper nuance of them, don't you need to speak the language? That's my question.
Should we collect a few, or what would you?
Yes, I just want to say quickly, the knowledge of language was not really the selecting principle, just to clarify for the panel. it was more on the expertise, so here it's like a
Well, that's except that sort of begs the
really-
question.
yes,
If that's
yes,
right,
yes,
why
yes.
have we ended up with four people on the panel
Yeah.
from the region?
Well,
I mean, I find it fascinating what you're saying, because not only that, but we're also for people who have worked or, have been working in these sort of, I don't know what you call it, international institutions. So it's almost like to access this data, it's not just enough to speak the language, because in fact, a lot of scholars in the region might not have the expertise to access it. And as we know, I think I have the same problem as you in accessing it. So we don't even have the expertise, but it's not just that. I think it's the language, and then having to been outside of that society almost becomes like a qualifying criteria, which limits the scope or like this democratic capacity of these archives, because it's limited to individuals who speak the language and have maybe moved out of the, that context perhaps. It's a very narrow group of people who can use the data.
Interesting.
yeah, but I think the extent, maybe you could, I think this is the language question really important. There were books written about the role of translation in the trials as well, which are fascinating themselves. But I think also the extent of translated documents into English has opened the work of the ICTY to a much bigger community of researchers who can use sophisticated analytical techniques. So.
Yeah, maybe I have to say a few
So,
words
yeah.
before we collect other questions. But first of all, let me just say I'm very happy that you're here and representative of the defense and Wade Jordash. I've spent a good part of 20 years watching him age like we all do in court. So, and I have the utmost respect, and I say this genuinely for every single person that is engaged in the trials, because the trials have no legitimacy if these people are not well defended. So I will always absolutely support, and I'm very happy to speak to and have conversations with defense lawyers as well. And I'm very happy that Jordash is involved in the Ukraine investigations very actively right now, because he's someone who knows what he's doing. For the language, absolutely, much of it is translated for at the graduate level, with the students that I supervise, I always advise, knowing a language is always taking you one step further to be able to grasp other things which maybe don't end up in your thesis or your PhD dissertation, but will bring the richness of an understanding of a certain context. As a historian, context is almost everything to me. So I think language always and absolutely is a benefit. So I would absolutely invite all young scholars to think about learning languages as a way of going forward with research.
Okay, so we have a question there first.
Thank you to all three of you. I'm Sanya Mitsu, and I have a question for Eva. So you said that these archives are very hard to navigate without clear guidance. So I wonder what your research questions were. So what your selection criteria, I guess, were.
Right.
But also you mentioned, because you said you spoke to people on the same side, so I wondered why not look at what they did rather than asking them what they think, or if you...
What do you mean I spoke to the people? Because I didn't conduct interviews, so that's what I didn't do that, no.
But in archives, you looked at some statements, I imagine, is that right?
Yeah.
So, but then I think, I guess it depends on your research question, so maybe that answer would clarify my second question, because then I wonder whether it is good not only to look at what people say, but also what they did, or if you did that as well. I'm interested in the dynamics you found between. So yeah, those are my questions. Thank you.
Okay, so let's take a question here and then a question there, collate, yeah?
Okay. I have a list here directly from the tribunal's
Sorry,
website.
can you introduce yourself?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. I said I have a list.
Can you introduce yourself, please?
Okay. I am Misha Gavrilović, one of the baddies, by the way, from former Yugoslavia, because I'm a Serb. I'm a native of Belgrade. Belgrade, incidentally, is the only capital in the world that has been bombed by both NATO and the Nazis. It is also the very first capital in Europe that has been bombed by, in this case, Austria-Hungary, a major power, at the start of the First World War. So one has had numerous unlikely visitors, and one is certainly in a better position than most to make a distinction between. But that is something that we can, make of as osmosis. I have a list here of 86 judges at the Hague Tribunal that were provided by a total of 51 states. Right, I can't go through it all, but it begins with Argentina, Carmen Argibay, and ends with Elizabeth Gwaunza from Zimbabwe. There is one thing that is unique to all of them, as well as to the states in particular. Not one of the states has been prepared to come forward and say, we recognize the laws that are being used here, and we are prepared also to submit ourselves to these laws. If not now, during the procedures, then maybe sometime in the future when we are involved in a war as well. So basically, we don't have anyone here whom I would regard as neutral. But a big decision is made between those who have actually been dropping bombs on Serbia, and especially the Federal Republic Yugoslavia, as well as the Republika Srpska, and those who are present but have not done anything of that nature. I mean, basically, I should tell you that 13 NATO states, led by the United States, have done the bombing.
Yes.
I do not accept their neutrality and objectivity.
That's your right, absolutely.
That's my right, that's my right.
Okay,
And if I can still add something very important.
We'll have, we can chat afterwards.
It's to do now with this, which I think is very good, addressing impunity and, because whatever we do, and there have been criticisms of the information that is there, all the procedures, in other words, the trials that were there, are in fact available, often in audio format, right? The one that I followed in particular has been that of Mr. Milošević, right? His name has been used at times more often than that of the American president. Because of the dominance of the Anglo-Saxon language, something like that has happened very seldom.
Can we please move on?
Okay, I'm going to
another
move on
question,
that.
yes.
But anyway, to make the point, the information is available, right, in which you can hear the defense. That is my main point. I have not heard anybody here where the defense position was provided, let us say Mr. Milošević, Mr. Karadzic, Mladic, right? But it was heard at the tribunal, ad hoc and whatever it was. So I hope that we can take, in fact, what was stated very clearly, right? It's on record, and at long last have a discussion from that point of view, from the position of the defense. And I think that is very important, and we will have a much better view on what has been happening in former Yugoslavia and, of course, in The Hague. Thank you very much for the information.
And we have a question there.
I'll be, Vesna Popovski, European Institute, I'll be very short. What I think all three of you very much discussing is the quality of data which we have as a result of what is collected in these archives. And what I'm interested in, the issues which could be raised in creating histories, for example, with the type of data which we have and what we do not have as a result, either because it's crossed out or because it's declassified.
So,
Should we start answering
yeah, I
some
think
of it?
it would be interesting.
All right, I'll try to, on the go, kind of mix things up and maybe reflect also on some of the things that you were saying as well. First, to start off, how to find Mladic's diaries. The key thing is evidence exhibit number. That's what you need. So you need P1234 or D1234 or something like that. So how you do that is to look at a judgment, search where they cite the thing, Look at the number, copy that. It doesn't work like Google, so you can't just like, no. So exhibit number is what you need, and then if P1234 doesn't result in anything, then try P01234 or P001234. So that's a little bit the skill that you need to develop. So exhibit number is the key entry point. In relation to what is in there and what it isn't there. So absolutely the investigations and prosecution and then the defense arguments to the prosecution's case are what is in there. And to reflect on some of what you were saying as well, the defense case is in there as well. The documents, the testimonies provided by the defense is there as well. So everyone in this room and everywhere in the world can access all of these things and write whatever they want, and then the world and the other scholars and the reading public will say what they think about it. So we're all at the mercy of our readers, but it's all in there, and I think it's great that it's in there. So in relation to what is missing, and this I think is something that also appeared in kind of several questions at the same time. What I think is not is missing or is not in there is, for example, the organized crime aspect of things. It comes in, for example, looting is widespread, extortion of people who are fleeing is, but like, that's not something that was really central. And what my colleague Vladimir Petrović was also saying recently in another event where we were in is who profited from all of that? Who got all this money? Who got all these fridges? Who got all of the gold that was taken from other people? We don't know that. Because that was never really kind of the end profiteer was never, I think, kind of something that we got in there. Also, some of the things that Jasna was writing about, also these kind of more structural reasons why, more of these situational kinds of reasons why violence erupts in one place and not necessarily in another. That's also something that we're not going to find out. There's, almost 5,000 people testified, but for example, there are stories of witnesses, and I know this because I worked in Bosnia and Herzegovina as well, who may have a truthful story to tell, but because of something that happened in their life, they're not stable, so they're never put on the stand because they just don't look convincing. There might be saying a true story, but they don't look like they are. So their story was never really presented. So those kinds of stories as well. There's endless villages that were wiped out that never appeared in an indictment because we already have 50 villages like that. Why have the 51st one? Because of course, from the perspective of the court, they need to be economical. And of course they do, because already these trials are 5 years long. In some cases like Harac and Mladic, and it was as well in the Milosevic case, so they need to be economical. So they can't possibly charge everything. So there's a bunch of silences in there as well. There's stigma that drives certain kinds of crimes to be kind of silent, like sexual violence against males, for example, is also something that doesn't really come in the record. So, all these kinds of things are not in there. I just wanted to say one thing, maybe, that appeared that I think is really important, which is about the physical location of the archive. I might be in the minority on this, but I don't think it matters. It was a big discussion, it was a big controversy. I think they're best left where they are. Maybe this is awful to say, but I don't trust any of the states in the region with it. I really don't. None of them. I would not give it to anyone. They're UN documents, and I think they should, and copies to everyone. You want it? Here you go, boom. But I would not split it up. I would not take the archives apart. I think that would in itself bring a lot of controversy and damage. So I think copies to everyone, originals to no one. That would be my answer to that. Because I think if you start splitting them apart, then I think they lose. First of all, I don't know how you would do that. But even if you did, I think that would kind of ruin them in many ways. There's a bunch of other stuff that I wanted to say. Just maybe one last point on your criticism of the tribunal is a very broad one. Many people share it, and it's fine. We don't need to all agree about the legitimacy of the institutions that live and work and exist in this world. I would say many of the judges come from countries that have indeed become part of the International Criminal Court, which also sits in The Hague, which has 121 state parties. But your criticism about the tribunal never looking at the NATO bombings or things like that is well known, and people can read about it. So I would still say that I wouldn't dismiss the tribunal as a source because it's still a good source of stuff, even if you disagree with Yalda, disagree with a bunch of stuff that came out of it in terms of judgments. But I still think that the depository of documents itself can be researched for all kinds of purposes. I'll leave it there just for the interest of time. Yeah.
Did you?
I was just wondering, my question about does the nature of the tribunal and the type of archive that it can produce, does it push us into certain types of historiography?
Right, well, I think that definitely elite driven. So what you were talking about, like this intentionalist, because that's kind of like they're trying to prove in some of the cases, the intent bit is actually crucial. So for example, for genocide cases. So, you know, this intentionality and kind of planning and stuff is probably overplayed in some instances, the same ways that the defense often play out these like, oh, it just happened kind of, and of course, I mean, that's kind of their job in these kinds of situations. So I think this elite-focused intentionalist kind of approaches definitely are prevalent. One thing that also might be missing is kind of perpetrator stories, even though I'm one of those people that would say that it is not possible to know in a lot of cases like why someone does something. I just don't think, some things are unknowable. Some things are unknowable about why people commit some kinds of violence. There are people who pleaded guilty and then said something and testified as insiders against someone else, but overall this really is a category of people where we don't know that much about what drove them to do what they were doing. So I think that's also an important part of what was missing. Yes, I think I'll just leave it there because I think we have like 11-12 minutes to go.
Are there any other questions from the audience? Yes.
Hi, thank you. I'm Noah. I am a PhD student at the European Institute here at LSEE. Thank you all. And I wanted to pick up on something that I think it was Ivor who mentioned about the legitimacy around collecting documentation in relation to the kind of colossal nature of this archive, as you mentioned. And I'm wondering, while that sounds incredibly convincing that the act of collecting huge amounts of documentation will contribute towards some perceived legitimacies, I'm wondering what you understand to be, if there's any limitations, in fact, on how legitimate the archives may end up being, given the nature of the size. So to what extent the mammoth amount of documentations, in fact, may paradoxically sort of undermine any attempt to create new knowledge through the use of the archives, and in fact sort of undermine any perceived legitimacy of narratives that we may be able to construct from engaging with these documents. Although I understand that, as Denisa mentioned, the new opportunities offered by digitization may serve to quell some of the limitations on the legitimacy, given that no one person can sort of take a global approach or a global perspective of what the archive holistically contains.
Right.
Thank you.
Maybe I can just take that and maybe reflect also to a more contemporary example of Ukraine that also appeared in some of our conversations just before the event, because I think Ukraine is an unprecedented situation where everyone seems to be interested in documenting, and that actually may create a lot of problems down the line, because the lawyers in the room will know that, not to talk about even the ethics of interviewing people repeatedly, not always with a clear intention of where these are going to go, because procedurally courts are different and have different rules and then have very strict rules about admissibility and things like that. But there's a certain there's a trendiness in accountability, there's a trendiness in documenting, and it's not always clear, are we all trained to do it? Are we all know what we're documenting for? And I think there is, the Ukraine example, I think, is a good one when it comes to kind of this popularity almost of documenting, and potentially the trouble that it also might bring down the line. In terms of volume, I think it's not very helpful to think about it as like a one story that the tribunal took, because sometimes different judgments are like trial level, appeal level have different takes on things. Sometimes you have very powerful dissents where not even the same trial chamber is on the same planet when it comes to their arguments. So I would say the tribunal's archive really does not tell a unified story. There's also cases that ended with what we would call controversial acquittals. And often this is taken to say this didn't happen. That's not true. Actually, in several cases, the judges say these crimes happened. It's just that this guy, because the standard of proof is so high, it's beyond a reasonable doubt. That means no other explanation exists. That's not the standard that I use, or that's a very high standard. So the judges simply, in that case, say, oh, we just are not convinced, right? Historians, I think, work mostly with some kind of probability or likelihood, and we're more comfortable with kind of the gray. Judges are like, yes, no. There's no like, well, maybe, or So I think that is also a little bit the difference, the difference between it. So I think in some ways the volume can be, can work towards legitimacy, can work to kind of support the institution's standing, but on the other hand, we also really need to be very careful about saying, oh, this is some unified story that they're telling, because I really think if you look at the judgments at the ICTY, that really is not necessarily the case. But yeah, very interesting story about this volume and legitimacy. It's very interesting. Thank you.
My name is Maria, and I'm a student at LSEE. My question is, what can be your recommendation to Ukraine? How to document it, how to collect it, how to make it work better for those who will conduct the research, historical research, maybe legal research as well?
Right. I would say look at the former Yugoslavia and don't do some of the things that we did. For example, in absentia trials, don't do it. Don't do it, make no sense. In absentia trials. So, but I think there's certain things, for example, I know this would be very difficult to implement, but some kind of a certification process where not everyone on earth can just walk around Ukraine with a recorder and be like, hello, you were raped. How is that? It's just not, but no, because some of it is really brutal. Some of the journalists are really, and so I would say the state or some entity. And I'm thinking as I'm speaking, but there should be some way of saying you have some badge that says you have some elementary training, you have some idea about how to work with vulnerable people, you're not going to traumatize people, you're not going to interview them if there's no need to, So a little bit of some kind of care where it's not kind of a free-for-all sort of a situation, where I think is in some ways maybe now is the case, because Ukraine, of course, large parts of it are accessible, people go there and travel and all of that. So it seems to me that maybe a little bit more kind of a stricter approach as to who can go around documenting things. And I think in some ways donor states are also to blame here, because they're funding a lot of these kinds of efforts without necessarily being kind of strict about, hey, does this really need to be done? Maybe there's some other things that you could be giving money to or support, social support or something. Maybe we could do that instead of 30 organizations or 50 organizations documenting, So I think, and luckily that is very much happening. I think lots of states are providing expertise as well, but there's examples out there in the world where Ukrainians can look in the next, because this is a long game, so you're going to be dealing with this for decades to come. You can look and be like, they did that, doesn't work. Let's try something else, or not to repeat. For example, like for Croatia did a bunch of in absentia trials. Don't do it. There's not, I don't see the point.
Hi, I'm Andreas. I'm doing a PhD on similar topics to Ivor at King's. And my question is around what you were mentioning around the research ethics side of this kind of research, because I think research ethics, broadly speaking, is something that I think is kind of new and people are now taking seriously, but in terms of how you should approach using sources that are publicly available like this and writing about it, I've never seen any training about it at King's or any institution I've ever been at. It's just something that I think people assume how to do it, and so I wonder if you can speak a bit about that, because I think people would be quite interested to hear that.
Yeah, absolutely, and I'm happy that it's becoming more and more a theme. Also with teaching in when it comes to mass violence and things like that, it's almost shocking that you finish a PhD and you're just like, yep, go teach genocide, Holocaust, good luck. No one tells you what to show, what not to show, how to contextual what you're showing. So for example, I kind of invented some rules for myself, which is, for example, I don't show any close-ups, I don't show people getting killed, I don't use people suffering for my own props in class. So I always ask myself 3 times, like, what is the purpose of this picture? But on the other hand, there is a certain kind of complete opposite to that, which is that how do you talk about mass violence without ever showing anything? It's then you're sanitizing things, then you are creating a reality that isn't, So it's a very different, and I think some of these things as well appear in research. I think one thing that we should be careful about is about naming people that are mentioned, for example, in testimony as perpetrators, if there's no other a confirmation of that. I don't think we should be using that person's name, because that person is named as a perpetrator from person X, but maybe no one else says that. So maybe then I would be like, I'm not going to tell this person's, I'm not the cops, it's not my job to be, calling out. People make mistakes, it could be a mistake. So with things like that, I would always try to triangulate and see is this person mentioned there, and there as well, from people from his own village, then they probably know him, right? Instead of just this name appeared one time, and also what is the purpose of this name for me, Also, I would never, ever, ever out a protected witness, because if you read these trials, you can figure, there's 8 or 9 survivors from Srebrenica, you can figure out, especially because some of them appear in documentaries, you can totally figure out who's who from their stories, right? So I would never, because it's illegal, but it's also what would this name do to my, research and things like that. So I think we should really think about these are people, and this goes for alleged perpetrators as well, because these are, and especially if they haven't been through a legal proceeding, I would be very careful with, for example, using names. That's just one example. There, but maybe later, we can because I would also be curious in your own research, sort of what kind of things you come across and what but I would absolutely invite universities to be a little bit more deliberate, not only with interviewing people, but also archives of violence.
Absolutely. I think, Andres, you raised a really, really important question, and I actually thought, Eva, you gave a very sort of considerate answer, thinking how researchers can harm through doing research, right? So basically one of the key consideration when we talk about research ethics is not to do that. But I think implicit in that is, given the discussions on research ethics, that research can also harm the researchers. So I think probably this is maybe for later on that, I'd be quite curious to discuss with you. It is really, I work with some of these sources, and this is a difficult reading, sort of, and especially, when you do a PhD, this is basically your life, 24/7. But also, for example, at LSEE, what we've started doing, we do have a sort of a note, right, on courses that deal with mass atrocity, deal with issues like reconciliation after mass atrocity, wherever there is content that can disturb students. Because I think it's kind of interesting in the educational environment for us as professional researchers. I'm not going to say that we are used to it, but we have different sort of sensibility with which we approach the material. Whereas when we bring it to the classroom, right, the students are exposed to something they don't see on a regular basis. So I think this kind of we have started to think through kind of how we tackle this difficult material, and there are no simple answers. I'm mindful of the time. I just want to thank all our panelists. I think Eva gave a fantastic introductory sort of made a little contribution, but also the questions from Jasna and Ivor really contributed to this really exciting sort of important discussion. And thank you also for being here and for all your questions.
Thank you
And
for inviting me.
we'll